This episode of MMA Nuts is brought to you by GoDaddy.com. Use code 249NUTS to get $249 domain registration or transfer. Defense Soap. Use code MMA Nuts for 15% off your entire order. Hey fans, this is MMA Nuts, episode 155.
155.
My name's Ingo Weigold.
I'm Matt Griffith. This is MMA Show by MMA fans, for MMA fans, where we walk the line between serious and ridiculous.
Yes, we do. And joining us on the show today, we have Executive Director of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, Kaizer. Welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent. Thank you for taking time out of your day. I know you're very busy. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, I think a lot of fans out there, maybe they don't know what are you up to? How did you kind of get started in this progression that got you to this point?
Sure. I grew up in Chicagoland. Went to college, first high school, Portage High School in Indiana. Went to Valparaiso University for college, and then Illinois down in Champaign for law school, and just decided I wanted to get out of the cold winters. That was my main goal. I wanted to find out where to go. So I kind of looked around different places, Charlotte, North Carolina, even Denver, Colorado has a lot of snow, but not much cold. And then Las Vegas were the three places I looked at. And actually, one of the reasons I wanted to go to Vegas is I always grew up to be a boxing fan. In Northwest Indiana, there's not many fights, if any. So it wasn't one where I was able to kind of go in person, but I was able to go to or see a lot of fights on TV. Back then, of course, there was a lot more free TV fights than there are nowadays. So that was one of the reasons, and the weather, to move out to Las Vegas. Came out here, Super Bowl weekend of 1992, was an attorney for one of the top labor law firms in the state, and then moved over to the Attorney General's office in 1997. And after about a month on the job there, the number 2 deputy for the Nevada Athletic Commission was moving on to take a job in private industry. And the chief of the office came to me and said, "Hey, I know you're a big fight fan. Would you like to be the number 2 deputy for the Athletic?" I said, "Absolutely, would like to do that." Did that, became the chief deputy a couple of years later. Also was the chief deputy for the Gaming Commission. So it was a great spot to be in, being the top attorney for both the gaming industry and the boxing industry. And then MMA came along as well on top of that soon thereafter for the whole state of Nevada. Did that for a little over 5 years as the chief. And then when Mark Ratner left to go to the UFC, they picked me to take his place. And that actually be seven years to the day come June 1st.
Nice. Can you take us a little bit through, like, what is your day-to-day like? I mean, I assume it's different when there's not an event happening versus when there is an event happening. I mean, what are you up to?
Well, most of our work on the administration end happens during the week. It's a normal 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 type day. What we do is we look ahead to see what's coming up, what fights are coming up. We'll work with the promoter. There's usually a point person, usually the matchmaker, but sometimes it might be a medical person. And what they do is they'll get us the medical records for the fighters, or they'll have the fighters deliver them themselves. Make sure everybody's licensed, medically speaking. I'll then review the fighter to see if they're eligible to get a license based on recent performance and other variables. And then the matchmaker will show us what the potential matchup is. And then I'll look at that, whether to approve that or disapprove that. Once that's all kind of done and the card is set, then we go into the process of selecting the officials, assigning them to the card as a whole. As we get closer to the event, then we'll assign them to specific fights on that card. Also, we'll get with them and let them know, and the inspectors know when the card is, when the report time is, what fights they have, who they're assigned to. Work with the promoter to get the weigh-in set up, make sure the ringside doctors come, because they give a pretty healthy, full physical to these fighters at the weigh-in. I'll weigh the fighters, record the weights, come back the next day, do the show. So once we get to the weigh-in, we've pretty much done all our paperwork. It's just a matter of the doctors, the inspectors, and the ring officials doing their jobs thereafter. We'll keep the score, deal with any issues they have in fight night, and then come back on Monday and send it all in to the appropriate timekeeper, or the record keeper, I should say, authorities, so the fighters get their credit for their fights.
Hey, Keith, we're getting a little bit of feedback from you. Is it possible on your end maybe to turn us down a little bit? Might be
Yes.
when you're talking. Yeah, it's much better now. Thank you. So that sounds like a really busy day, really busy weekend. How do you? I mean, do you sleep? It's
Overrated.
yeah. Do you have a lot of people working for you? Is that kind of what makes it possible, or?
Well, no, unfortunately, we don't. We have five of us total, though we're down to four right now. We have someone retiring in our office who's been a great help for the last couple of years. So there's only five full-time positions at the office as far as getting all the paperwork done. But we rely on, we have a consulting research physician, Dr. Trainer, who does a lot of the checking on the medicals that aren't uh, obvious or aren't normal. We have a staff person who goes through them and checks everything off. But if there's any issues whatsoever, we check with him, and then he'll either clear the person or send them out to a specialist. So there's a lot of no during the week. It's very difficult. Actually, when I get to the fight, that's when I start to relax in the sense of our work is done. Now it's time for the fighters to perform. And then once the fight's over, my favorite part of the night is when the fights are over, no one got seriously injured, and I can go on and enjoy my shortened weekend. And so it's not feeling when you walk out of there. I mean, like the UFC we just had, it was a great ending, some great finishes at the end there. I think the last four fights all were stoppages, one submission and three TKOs, but very definitive stoppages, uh, clear winners. I think the fans all went home happy, even if they might have been rooting for the other guy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a great feeling walking out of the MGM last Saturday.
And then like some of the judges, like we hear a lot of people. And you probably have one of the most criticized positions in Nevada, maybe in all of sports, because you're overseeing all these guys. If you have, like, say you have a controversial decision, do you go through like with the judge, or how does that review process work?
Well, I might. It depends on if there's something to review. Most of the time, 95% of the time, I'm there ringside.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you all know, even watching on TV, let alone being live, you'll see rounds where you two might disagree. And so I'm not gonna, if I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, wow, that's a close round, that could go either way. It won't surprise me to see the judges disagree. That's why we have three judges,
Hmm.
because it's not it's a lot of these rounds are not clear cut, and it's just going to depend on how you weigh certain things. That's why it's a sport that's done by judging as opposed to other means of scoring like touchdowns or field goals. So it's a situation where it's always going to be open, no matter what somebody does. I mean, you can think of anyone you can think of in sports, any official, be it a referee in boxing or a judge in MMA or a referee in basketball or an umpire in baseball. You go to a message board for that sport and you say, let's say you think that's the best official in the game. I pretty much can guarantee you, if you do a thread saying, I think so and so is the best umpire in Major League Baseball, it probably won't be very long until people start calling you names on the thread and saying how
Yeah.
great
Right.
you are.
It's usually
And
about
vice
two
versa for
posts.
that matter. If you, hey, I think this umpire is horrible. So, I give a story. Uh, it's not a nice story, but I give a story sometimes when I talk about this subject. We actually had a situation which could have been very tragic. Luckily, it wasn't here in Nevada. Probably about 6 months ago, maybe a little longer. A teenage girl, I think she was 15 or 14, she got abducted. And they actually had it on the main newspaper. Here's the Las Vegas Review Journal. They actually had it up on their website about, hey, this girl's missing. Here's a description of her. Here was she's last seen. It looks like she was abducted from some of the witnesses that were walking by the area. And they have the comment section on the story, and you couldn't believe. And this girl was still missing. She could have been dead. She could have been being raped. Who knows what? Most of the comments on the section were, she's probably out effing her boyfriend, or something about her ethnicity or something. And it's like, this girl, I keep saying woman, she wasn't a woman. She's a 13-year-old girl. She's still missing. Her parents are probably checking this website for clues, hopefully getting some sort of, hey, I saw your daughter here or there, or here's the license plate of the truck that abducted her. And so that's the mentality of people who complain or criticize or want their voice to be heard, of course, with some kind of moniker. And it's unfortunate. Now, that doesn't mean that every criticism's invalid, but that unfortunately is the starting point in our society. And so, can only imagine what those parents are going through. So when I hear people lying or name calling me or officials or fighters or promoters, I feel bad for them. I mean, no one likes to be called names or be lied about, but that pales in comparison to what unfortunately other people who suffer real tragedies have to deal with. It's not a nice starting point, but it's a realistic one.
So you guys, have you thought at all about doing something like the NFL does, which is they have a review system for their officials and maybe for the refs and the judges in MMA, or in general, where I think they have a review board where they're constantly training these guys and teaching them about you did the right thing here, you did the wrong thing there. Has that ever come up? Or
Well, we basically do that as we go. In other words, every time we have a fight, we have, say, anywhere from 6 to 12 fights on the card. Uh, if there's anything that is kind of controversial, or maybe not controversial, but is a learning experience, we'll bring it up right afterwards. When it's fresh in everybody's mind, we have a meeting right after the fight. I give everybody their checks after the fight, and then we'll sit down and we'll talk about it. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily be controversial to be a learning experience, but we might go through this. Hey, look, this was a weird situation. You had a deducted point for a very seldom called foul, or why did you stand the fighters up here, or why did you stop the fight here? And I'm not going to, sometimes if it's so obvious, hey, obviously here's why the referee stopped the fight, or here's why the three judges went 10-8. It may not be it may be over obvious. There's maybe no need to it, but there's a lot of situations where, and it might be a situation, hey, like the last fight, there wasn't much to go on there, but let's have the referees talk about the stoppages, the last couple stoppages that happened in those fights, just because they were the third man in the ring, in this case the octagon. They had a unique perspective, so it might be something as benign as that. But sometimes it might be more detailed. It might be the judges might disagree. Some had it 10-9, two had it 10-9, one had it 10-8. Well, first off, were you close to going the other way? Did you see it as a clear-cut 10-9 or a clear-cut 10-8, or were you more somewhere in the middle? If so, why? If not, why? Sometimes the judges will say, "Hey, I was right on the middle, and here's why I went 9 instead of 8, or vice versa." Or it might be a situation, no, I didn't even think about 10-8, and here's why I thought it was a clear 10-9, just to kind of get some sort of consistency. And then I want to hear from the other judge. And sometimes it might be just a matter of how much you're weighing. I thought those punches did more damage than you did, or I thought the person had more control of the fight longer than you did. So, but at least they're using the same criteria. It's just a matter of how subjectively they felt about either that damage or that control or that effective aggression. But if they verbalize it, it helps them maybe get to a more even feel on how to score a fight. And then the same with the officials, why, or referees, why did you take a point away, or why didn't you take a point away? And they'll go through the process on why they made the decision they made. So we kind of try to do that right then and there. We also do have annual seminars too, where we'll go through and talk to the officials. The referees, I think, during the fight, they need to be, there's no communication. It doesn't matter what the other judge scored it. You don't even know what that is, nor should you know. You shouldn't even worry about how you scored the previous round. It's a whole new ball game come the next round. But the referees, because there's only one of them, there's no need to kind of have that feeling of isolation. So they'll get together a lot before the fights, after the fights, go through different scenarios, throw out different scenarios to themselves. Plus, it's a smaller group. There's only one judge per ref per fight compared to 3 judges, so we have less. We have only 3 or 4 referees per fight card compared to, say, 6 or 8 judges. And same with boxing too. There's less because it's obviously a 1-to-3 ratio. So they'll do a lot of informal together training too. I tell people, all the time, the officials, you first and foremost need to be proactive in your journey. No matter how good you are, you always want to strive to be better. I try to take that approach to myself as well. So they need to go and constantly try to better themselves, just like athletes. Gym, working out, when you're trying to become a better athlete, when you're home alone or you're on vacation or something, try to keep your training going or your diet going well, things like that. Study tape, whatever you do. And that's what these officials do too. They'll go home, or they'll get in smaller groups away from the fights and study tape or review certain situations. So that's kind of the starting point, is these people being self-motivated. Then they come to us, and then, like I said, we'll have the fight night, post-fight meetings. We'll have other seminar meetings where we get involved. And it tries to, I hope it works well. People are going to disagree. People are fanatics. That's what fans are. We appreciate that. It's kind of weird though. I like this new website. It's fairly new, called MMA Decisions. And I'm always interested after a very close fight where maybe it's a split decision, a fight card we had. They'll list it how the top media had it.
Cool.
And it's very rare for a split decision for the official judges not to also be a split decision among the MMA media, and that, which isn't surprising and shouldn't be surprising, though people will still disagree about whether it was a robbery or not. But that's another.
Yeah.
Well, I struggle with that too, because we give predictions on fights, and if I've picked the right guy and it's a split decision that goes in his favor, I'm
Yes.
always like, well, fuck, I think my guy won, regardless of what I actually saw. So
Yeah.
it's hard to balance that at times, but you see it.
That's what makes it fun, though.
It's true.
The human element,
Yeah.
I guess. I have another question kind of to follow up what you just said. I think our Facebook page, there was predominantly people were asking this. The eye poke situation, it seems like it's getting kind of serious, and I know they're working on gloves, and maybe you can touch on if you guys are working with the UFC about that. But in general, the rule seems to be that if there's an eye poke, they don't get 5 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, with the eye poke situation, it's something where if it's a type of eye poke injury that can be resolved briefly, a reasonable amount of time, I'd say no greater than 5 minutes. But usually, if an eye poke is resolvable, it's resolvable within a minute or two,
Okay.
or it's not resolvable at all until you go in the back and get treatment on it. So obviously, if a fighter gets eye poked and he just can't continue, there's no point of giving him time. Let's stop the fight. Let's get him in the back, get him treated, make sure he doesn't lose his vision. Same thing happens if there's a foul and there's a concussion. We're not going to wait and see if the fighter can clear a concussion. That's not going to happen in 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 60 minutes. We're going to get him off to the hospital is what we're going to do. So, but you hope if there's a situation where the fighter can recover after a minute or two or three and the fight can continue, that's the best case scenario, short of, again, a situation where he's seriously injured and needs to be treated. We've had a couple eye poke situations, the Koscheck Johnson fight, I believe,
Yeah.
where we
Oh,
had
yeah.
Yeah.
it looked at initially when the doctor checked him, wasn't sure whether he'd be able to clear his eye or not, get the vision back, but he actually recovered rather nicely, and the fight was able to continue. So that's what you always hope to do as the referee. Sometimes if you need to bring the doctor in, you do, but you hope the fight can continue unless, again, there's an injury that needs to be treated right away. As far as the gloves go, people have been talking about this since before the UFC existed, I think, different types of gloves for grappling. There obviously was MMA before there was a UFC. And the problem, of course, is the trade-off between striking and grappling. I think where it is now is probably the best it's going to be. Whether there could be some configuration, they talk about maybe making it slightly more curved or something along those lines that may have somewhat of an effect. We haven't had many eye pokes lately. We did go through a situation where we had a few, and I think there was just a few the other day. And I think in one UFC there was 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost a situation where you might not hear about any kind of serious eye pokes for another 6 months or 12 months, or you might have 4 on the next big MMA card. So it's good to keep looking at that. My personal feeling is they would have found a solution already if there was one. But if people want to keep looking, more power to them. Maybe they'll find something that no one else has thought of.
Well, do you think it's more of the fighter himself or the glove? Because it seems a lot of times these guys are just kind of pawing out, where if they just had their fists clenched, maybe we'd have less of an issue.
Yeah, I think a lot of fouls happen because of perhaps the fighter not taking enough safeguards. Sometimes fighters hurt themselves. They'll break a hand or something because they throw a punch sloppily or they don't turn over their hook or something like that. So, obviously there's a lot more going on in a fighter's mind than just how good he looks throwing a punch. So I understand stressful situation and he or she may not be able to execute like they were able to do in the gym with a lot less pressure. So it's always going to be there. There's always going to be a human element, I guess, a human error situation with a fighter doing some technique wrong. I don't know how to limit that either. It doesn't seem like a lot of these eye poke situations are because they're beginners. A lot of these situations happen with top 10 fighters.
Mm-hmm.
So I think more of it's the nature of the sport than it is perhaps laziness or something along those lines of a fighter. But there'll always be a human element to it as well. I don't know what else, those type of fouls, unless a fighter is purposely being overly aggressive, perhaps, and not, pawing maybe with their fingers open. And you'll see referees sometimes say, "Hey,
Hmm.
close those fingers if you're going to throw those type of strikes." Short of a fighter doing that, where the referee can warn him or her, it's almost always going to be a situation where it's going to be very difficult to stop it from happening.
Yeah. What about the one hand on the ground knee issue? Is that something that you think needs to be changed, or it seems like that's happening a lot? And even the refs, do you allow them discretion? Like it seems like some refs will say, well, hey, stop playing that game, and that or and others will immediately call a foul if someone does that, even though it doesn't seem purposely.
There's a there's a couple things that come into play with calling a foul or not a foul. Sometimes I see people saying, "Well, that shot hit the guy in the back of the head. That's a foul." Not necessarily. If there's basically, it's probably the best thing to talk about three different scenarios with that is, if a fighter's throwing a punch and as the punch is on its way, the other fighter turns his head and hits him in the back of the head, that's not a foul. And there's no way the striking fighter could have stopped that from happening. Now, if a fighter is throwing punches to the guy's side of his head, he then turns his head, the opponent, and the striking fighter sees that, could adjust but chooses not to, that's a foul. Of course, there's also a situation where a fighter purposely hits the guy in the back of the head. So you could have an intentional foul, you could have accidental foul, or you could have a legal blow. And I think that's kind of with the some of the referees explaining to a lot of the fighters lately. I think more so than ever, which is a good thing. Is, look, if the fighter's in the midst of throwing a knee, and you're near the ground but you're not there yet, and as he's throwing the knee, you put your hand down. I'm not calling that as a foul. Now, on the other hand, if you put it down before he throws the knee, but you're kind of playing these games, if you get hit, and I do, if I think your opponent could have stopped and didn't, I'm not going to call it intentional. I'm going to call it accidental because you're contributing to it, as opposed to a situation where a fighter just gets overly excited, knows his opponent's on the ground, but throws the knee anyway. Isn't trying to purposely break the rules, but is overly excited and does something he or she shouldn't have. That's an intentional foul. You meant to throw a knee. You knew your opponent was on the ground. The fact that you're overexcited and didn't stop yourself, maybe that I'm not going to fine you as the executive director, but the referee is going to take the 2 points away or disqualify you or stand you up or whatever the situation calls for. So as far as the ref has the ability to call fighters for timidity or warn them in the situation that, hey, look, if you do that and you time it in such a way that your opponent was already throwing the kick or throwing the knee, I'm calling it a legal blow, and you're going to have to deal with the consequences on the receiving end of that blow.
Mhm.
Hopefully puts a little bit, at least the thought process in these fighters to try to be perhaps a little more professional or less timid. That's the name of the rule, is timidity. So you hope that's the situation. You hope the fans vote too. That's a big part of this. Sponsorship's a big part of these fighters' pay, and fans have turned away the fighters. Some of them who've taken PEDs or done other things. Hit guys after the bell or whatever,
Word here.
and it could affect their livelihood in that regard too. So it's always good to have fans voice their concerns about fighters that they don't feel are perhaps acting within the proper spirit.
Mhm.
Well, speaking of like rule changes, do you see any new rule changes happening anytime soon? Especially like in that case, we were talking about the hand being down, but that one specifically, or any other ones?
I don't know. We looked at this at the ABC level a couple years ago, especially Nick Lembo and myself and some others, and we actually got a lot of feedback from medical professionals, doctors, ringside physicians, even some gym people who are in charge of that type of stuff. And we were actually surprised at how hardcore they were to leave things as they are. And one of the examples I'll give you that people talk about is our elbows. Well, I thought about a situation on the downward elbow. I said, look, the fighters know already when their opponent is down, they're restricted in certain ways. They can't kick, they can't stop the guy, they can't knee the guy to the head, they can't kick the guy to the head, can't stop the guy at all. So maybe there's a situation where we can make the same thing with downward elbows, where you can't, downward elbow to the head of a downed opponent, but other downward elbows would be okay, because you don't want to have a situation where the rules are changing left and right, and fighters, have been training sometimes for 2 decades, might have a situation where they're, you don't want to change the rule just to change it. That's not the right way to look at it. So, but we had so much feedback from the doctors saying, no, even standing up, these downward elbows can be very dangerous. People don't understand how dangerous this can be. And the doctors were unanimous on this and very adamant. And so myself and Nick and others kind of, basically backed off on that. So it's surprising on some of these rules that even myself don't think are that big a deal. When you talk to the experts, in this case, the doctors, they say, no, that's a very big deal. Unfortunately, with a lot of the rules, in addition to the fact, again, you don't want to mess with fighters who've been training for years and years and years, unless there's a good reason for it. There always does seem to be somebody given a reason. I mean, there's a reason the rules put in place in the first place, and there'll be people out there saying, look, this is a real reason, like the downward elbow reason. There is a lot of situations where, I think the ground opponent is the best example. And I'm glad you guys bring that up, where there's a lot of maybe unintended consequences where you'll see a situation where a guy can't throw a knee or can't throw a kick, and you think that makes no sense. And it really doesn't necessarily make sense, other than you have to have some sort of bright line for these fighters. You have to have some situation where, and I've had people say, well, what if, only 3 of the 4 points of the body were down? Let's say the bottom of the feet and one hand. Well, think about it. You could have a situation where a fighter's falling backwards and puts a hand down, and then they get kicked in the head, and they had no ability to block it. Now, if they're putting it down, they're looking forward to their opponent, they're putting it down, playing a game, basically, then you don't feel much guilt for them or much sorrow for them at all. And I can understand why fans wouldn't say, oh, that's silly. Why can't you kick the fighter in the head?
You should be able to kick him in the groin then at that point.
Yeah, pretty much,
sure.
Yeah.
But you got to have the cutoff somewhere, and you got to have it somewhere that the fighters can train to avoid situation A, which is illegal, but capitalize on situation B, which is legal if the situation presents itself to them. So there's always going to be a line where you can always say, well, the line should be a little higher, the line should be a little lower, and you can't really say, well, no, of course not. Well, no, you can make a good argument there. So, but this is something, I mean, that I know Nick Lembo, especially as chairman of that committee, took a look at with a lot of help from a lot of different people, including some fans, as well as fighters and coaches. And most of the rules in place now had a pretty strong majority in favor of keeping them where they are.
Okay, like a follow-up question I have for you, and you mentioned PEDs a few minutes ago. Straight up, are you guys ever going to license Vitor Belfort in the current state he's in
for a therapeutic use exemption for TRT
in Vegas? Can he fight there?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know with any fighter until they submit everything they need to submit. They have to submit a lot of different documentations before we even get to the starting point. And I've had fighters, for example, where they've come to me because they've had some doctor tell them, some doctor who has his wallet open, you need to get on TRT. This is you're in a dangerous situation. You need this. Your levels are 480 or 520 or 420 or something, and those aren't below normal. Those are low normal, but they're not below normal, and they're not qualified, and they shouldn't be on it. Even if they weren't a fighter, they shouldn't be on it. There's a lot of drawback, as there is with any kind of serious medication. There's going to be side effects. So I've had fighters who've come to me, and I think they've come to me because they've been scared by their doctor, who's probably looking for some extra cash in his or her pocket. And I have to explain to them, look, hey, you're not qualified, and that's a good thing, and hopefully there's other things you can do, maybe change your diet or maybe some other types of non-prohibited supplements that you can take to raise that level, let's say from 450 to 500 or something, but it won't be TRT. The TRT cases we've only had, I think, 6 of them since we started doing MMA back in 2001. So you're talking, less than one every other year. And right now, I think there's only 3 fighters, Henderson, Sonnen, and Mir, who are active and have gotten TRT from us. And the other 3 who are retired now, Griffin, Roller, and Duffy. Not Duffy. No, well, Duffy's not retired, but he's no longer on TRT. And Roller and Griffin are retired. But they were all below 300. I mean, they were basically below 200 and had to go through this process. And then we test them. I do blood tests and I do urine tests because, even though the urine test may not mean anything on the T situation, I'll make sure they're not taking something else too, right, to deal with their low testosterone issue. So I'll do that several weeks out. I'll do it a few weeks out. I'll do it a couple weeks out. And then I'll do it fight night. Fight night, I'll do a urine test, and the morning after, they have to go down at their expense and get the blood test. And with the blood test, what we test for is total testosterone, free testosterone, FSH, LH, hematocrit, and hemoglobin. So not only do they have their own test that they did to get on the TRT or get the TRT recommendation from their own doctor, we'll do our own blood test for those 6 things, as well as having them, when they go there to give blood, hey, you might as well urinate as well. We're going to check you for other anabolic agents. So these are gentlemen who were, like I said, below 300, and in some cases even fight. I think Frank and Chael, I think it was Chael. I know it was Frank for sure. Even with TRT, when they fought, they're below 300. But they were 272 instead of 220. I mean, there's a lot of serious illnesses that can pop up for someone if they're below normal for testosterone. So, but that doesn't mean that you're going to take as much as you want. Again, even if you're not a fighter, there's going to be drawbacks if you take too much of that medication, as there is for most prescription medication. That's why the doctor will say take no more than 3 in a 24-hour period for painkillers or something like that. So anyway, so in those situations, there might be fighters who are, like I said, I've had fighters in the 400s, I've had fighters in the 500s who've been told by their doctor that they're a candidate for it, and I've had to explain to them, no, you're not, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So, and these fighters, when they're getting the TRT, they get up to, in those cases, they didn't even get past 300, but usually they get to the 500s. That's where they are. That's where they are maximum when they go to fight, and the weeks and months leading up to the fight when we test them, because we test them, like I said, several weeks out, a few weeks out, a couple weeks out, the day of the fight, the day after the fight. Any fighter, whether they have an exemption or not, always has the ability to try to cheat the system and take more of something he's entitled to, or but take more of it, super dose, or take something he's not entitled to take at all. And we have to play these cat and mouse games, unfortunately. I wish professionalism and ethics were enough to keep these guys in line, but I think most of them are kept in line. I know you guys like to give high numbers. I like to give low numbers because I'm around these fighters, and I think most of them do comply with the rules. It's easy to think everybody else doesn't have morals and ethics but you, but I think most of these guys do. But some don't. And we've caught a lot of guys. I've caught a lot of guys in my day, both as the attorney for the commission and the executive director, and it's unfortunate, and it's too bad, especially in a sport where you're hitting another human being in the head as hard as you can, and to do something like that is just unconscionable to me. But it does happen, and we have to be vigilant about it. But I hate painting with such a broad brush, and looking at everybody with suspicion if they haven't had any reason to have suspicion cast upon them. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to test less than 100%. I'm testing everybody, and I'm hoping everybody's clean because they didn't use anything. But if they did, hopefully we will catch them and we will deal with them. But as far as any specific athlete goes, I can't speak to him specifically as far as what he would need to do if there even is anything he could do. But my feeling on him, as it was with Chael Sonnen, for example, is you're going to go before the full commission because of your past. You're going to go before the full commission. Your burden's going to be higher. Now, in Chael's situation, his manager especially, I got to give Chael some credit too. He did a very good job for himself at the hearing, but his manager did a great job. They went to a specialist, not the doctor who showed up at the California hearing.
I watched that one live. That
was awesome.
That doctor, in my opinion, got information from him. Our doctor talked to him. We talked to our own experts in the field, and he was able to get it. But he actually went through a lot of tests as he had to do in my understanding, talking with Nick Lembo in New Jersey. He basically followed the same procedure we followed, which is very similar to what WADA follows on checking the levels for the fighter several times during the lead up to the fight, as well as fight night and the day after the fight. So in a situation with someone who's tested positive before for a PED, especially one like Mr. Belfort tested for, as well as the fact that I personally do not feel he was very truthful at his disciplinary hearing when we did have that situation, does not give me a comfort level, even if everything he turned in showed that he was the exception and not the rule in that regard. But go before the full commission and be up to them to decide thereafter. I don't know what they would do thereafter, but it'd be a very high burden on him or anyone else in his similar situation.
So can we transition as we're talking about testing and stuff?
Yes.
Can we go into marijuana a little bit? Like,
yes.
I know you guys test for it. What is your view on it? Do you consider that performance enhancing or what?
Well, I know that the main reason is the harm to the person taking it. We obviously are involved in a sport where there's dire consequences, especially if you are lethargic or your reflexes aren't where they should be. You could die. I mean, this is a very serious sport that we're dealing with here. And so we got to make sure these fighters, for whatever reason, whether it's drug induced or it's an injury or it's something going on in their personal lives where they can't focus right and they don't have the ability to perform to the standards they need to perform in the ring or the octagon or the cage that night, that they shouldn't be fighting. So that's the starting point, and that's what we asked them on the forum. This is a government forum under the penalty of perjury. List everything you've taken, prescription, over the counter, in the last 15 days. You might get knocked out cold. We need to know. The EMTs are going to have to work on you, try to save your life. Just if you or I went to get a surgery, a LASIK surgery or something, what have you eaten? When did you last eat? I mean, these are important aspects for them to know. What medications have you been taking? This isn't hide the ball time. This is the time where we're on your side here, and we got to make sure that A, you're fit to fight, and then B, if you get knocked out, that you're not going to be given something that's going to have a bad reaction with something that's already in your system, regardless whether you took it 10 minutes ago or you took it 10 days ago. And it's unfortunate we've had fighters lie out and out lie on that form, and it's I don't understand it. I don't understand. I mean, I understand if you took steroids, you're not going to put that on the form.
And that'd be interesting to put it down.
We had people put stuff down and we'll talk to them. Okay, when did you last take that? Okay, you can't take it anymore. You have to wait till after the fight. Even something as simple as aspirin, which you can't take leading up to the fight. Stick with Tylenol, and then once your fight is done, the next day you can go back to taking aspirin if that's what you prefer. But if you take it and you get hit and you get a bleed, it's going to make it worse, and it can change a bleed you survive to a bleed you don't survive. So it's very important just to be truthful first and foremost. I actually give a speech to the UFC where the gist of my speech is, look, you got to be honest with us. You got to be honest with your promoter. You got to be honest with your coach on what you're taking. Now, if there is a situation where there's something you need to take and we might tell you yes, but not that medication. You have to take an alternative, or you have to cut your dose in half. Or you might say that's fine. That's fine. There's no problem. But thanks for telling us just in case you do get knocked out. And I think marijuana kind of falls in that place. Now, there have been athletes out there who say it does help them perform. It helps them relax, or it helps them focus, or it helps them manage pain. I'm not going to disagree with them. I'm not in their mind if they think it helps them, whether it's psychosomatic or it's real. But I have heard a lot of athletes who say I do it and it does help my performance. I don't think I'm the one to say you're lying about that.
Yeah.
I think they're probably telling the truth on that, but that's not the main gist of it. Now, as far as what's going forward, we actually have this steroid and drug testing advisory panel the commission set up late last year to look at different issues. And one thing they're going to look at their next meeting will be the marijuana situation. And we were looking at the problem with marijuana, as you guys may know, unlike alcohol, when you get a reading on a person, whether they're a fighter or not, it doesn't necessarily tell you when they last used. It could have been 10 days ago. It could have been 10 hours ago. Now, if you fail a test for alcohol, everyone can be pretty sure you drank in the last 10 hours. You didn't drink 10 days ago. So it's kind of hard. It'd be nice if the test was much more specific for all of us, for the fighters and for the commission, that, hey, look, this test proves absolutely specifically he didn't smoke in the last 15 days, or he did smoke in the last 10 hours or whatever. So, and I think that's what WADA was trying to do. They even came out and said, look, we don't care about guys who smoked weeks or months before. We care about guys who smoked hours or days before. And they raised the limit to 150. And I think.
And from where is that? It was like 10 times higher now, right?
Yep. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yep, that's my understanding. They had 15 for their cutoff, and now it's up to 150. It was on the agenda. My understanding is that it was on the agenda for removing it from there. And I think in some sports it may not be a big deal. Right. But I don't know how anyone could say
basketball.
If someone,
basketball.
If someone, like I always give the example of the 100-meter dash or something, but I'm not sure if anyone could say in MMA or boxing that whether you smoked a lot of pot or not it would never have an effect on your own safety in the fight. Let's forget about the PD aspect for a second, though. Again, according to some fighters, it does give them an advantage. You got to be careful. You don't want fighters stoned in the ring or in the octagon. You also don't want them drunk, or you don't want them fighting in there with a broken arm. So you can't ignore it. Even if WADA had taken it off the list, I don't think we would have ignored it. But if they can find a better level or a better test or a more specific test, I think that's great. I think they kind of did the homework for us. And that's where we always try to start when we look at we have the ability, we're not a WADA signatory. We actually had a conference with Travis Tigert, Dr. Bowers from USADA. And they even said to myself and the commissioner I was with, look, we're a WADA signatory. I don't know if I'm using the term right, but whatever it is. And they said, there's a lot of things we don't agree with in WADA, but we have to follow it 100%. Even if we think there's a better way to do it, we have to follow it. To which I said, well, we don't have that restriction. We can take what's good and ignore what's not good, or we can add to it even. So actually the TRT requirements, we have additional requirements that WADA doesn't even have. But on the flip side, there's certain things that they are able to keep confidential because they're not a government body to the extent we are, and we don't. People all the time, well, how can Kaiser tell the press who's on TRT? Well, they make a public records request, and I have to fulfill it, or I'm violating the law. We're a government agency, and these documents are public records. So that's WADA doesn't fall under the public records law. So anyway, back to the issue with the marijuana. So what I think you'll see is I think you'll see the commission say, oh, that's a good idea. Let's go to 150. If that's going to be, we're still going to be able to make sure that people aren't fighting in the condition where they shouldn't be fighting. But on the other hand, we're going to go along with the rest of the drug testing community and have a rule that makes more sense. If the test is more sophisticated, or it makes more sense in that regard. I have a lot of faith in WADA, and I think they did a lot of homework on this issue. And I think that's a good thing. And the same thing happened with the TE ratio. For most of their existence, WADA uses 6-to-1. People say, Keith, where did the 6-to-1 came from? It came from WADA. We adopted it years ago when WADA had it 6-to-1. Now, about 7 or 8 years ago, they switched to 4-to-1 because they were worried about other people getting away with things. But they were very worried going from 6-to-1 to 4-to-1 because they were worried they were going to get some false positives and ruin some careers. Their attitude, from my understanding, is, it's not me. They've ruined a lot of, there's a lot of athletes will tell you how WADA has maybe been unfair to them. With cases where guys had things for hair loss or something where they get banned for 2 years, So we don't ever want to be that draconian. I hope we're not. Some people may disagree, but now with the CIR testing, if someone does break a certain, whatever the ratio you're using, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 10-to-1, whatever, you can do the CIR testing. Now it's very expensive, so you can't just do it as a matter of course on all fighters. And I don't know anyone who does that. If I was only testing 2 fighters a card, it might be something we could deal with. But I'm trying to test 20 guys a card. So, but we have that ability. So we're already looking at that. That's one thing that came out of the panel was, look, go down to 4-to-1. But anyone who's between 4 and 6, do the CIR test at our cost, not the fighter's cost. Not fair to label them, and then wait till that comes back before anything becomes official. As you know, in the day of the internet, you put a story out there that some guy did something wrong and you're wrong about it, and you do a retraction the next day, you still do a Google search for that person, those old stories are going to pop up, and people may not even know about that. It's even worse than the old days with the written word on the paper. So we want to be very careful. I'm surprised that some people are saying, maybe only 1% are going to get falsely accused and convicted. Who cares? It's only 1%. Who cares? I care. So I want to make sure of that. But I think the CIR testing where it's at now, still a relatively new test and unfortunately very expensive, though I think it'll come down, gives us that protection. And I think the same thing hopefully will happen with this new standard that WADA has set for the marijuana. The fighters are protected, both the opponent and the fighter taking the drug. But it's still going to be very important for these athletes to be honest. There's no excuse not to be honest on the forms.
And then another follow-up question. In Nevada, can you get a therapeutic use exemption for marijuana?
We've never had that. I think one of the reasons why I think we don't have it now because it's illegal, even though that the world is changing, and I'm not necessarily unhappy about that. But the part of it is if you get a TUE, it doesn't mean you get it for the drug of your choice or at the dosage of your choice. That's very important to note. And here's a lot of the TRT. People get TRT and they'll take as much to get up to the maximum. Some levels are 300 1,000. Some say 350 to 1,200, or I think 350 to 1199. I've seen both those standards for where they look for what's considered normal and what's not considered normal. But like I said, we're looking more like 500 when these guys get on TRT. But you still see people say like, oh, they can, if you get TRT, you can get up to 1199. Just don't get above it. Or you can get your ratio up to 6-to-1. And they think that means you can take have 6 times as much in your level, like 6,000 would be your count, I guess, for that, which you'd be dead. But so there's a lot of craziness out there on that. So you got to, the point with the marijuana or any kind of drug, TRT or any kind of drug, if you are eligible for the exemption, you have to follow it to the letter. You can't superdose. We had another fighter who was in the process of applying for a TRT, and we tested him, and his levels were very high. They weren't above 1,000, but they were high. They were, I think, 800s or 900s. And I'm like, well, wait a second. Why is this that high? You should be around 500 based on what you're taking and what, in the process. Oh, well, I take my shots on Wednesdays and you tested me on a Thursday morning. Okay. I said, well, you had told me you took your shots on Monday, because usually if someone's taking their shots every Monday, you want to test them about right in the middle of it, because that's where the level kind of levels out. So I said, okay, well, I double checked with the people who were working with him. They said, well, he told us Monday as well. I said, okay, well, I'm gonna test him even more now. So next time I test him, I said, okay, he's on Wednesday. I'll test him on Friday, or Saturday morning, whatever. So I tested him again. He was in the 900s. Well, what's going on here? Well, I took my shot on Friday this time. Okay, you're taking your shot. You're taking your weekly shot 4 times a week, apparently. You're going to need to go to, if you're going to pursue this, you need to go for the commission. Now, it turns out he ended up not fighting in Nevada, and it became moot to us. But it got to the point where I'm not going to approve a guy like that. I mean, everything else seemed to be in order. So he was a candidate for it. Probably was the legitimate need for it. But then he was superdosing. Well, then you don't get the exemption for that. So that's the one thing I think we'll have to look at if we ever get to that stage where someone applies for, say, medical marijuana, or we had that with Adderall, for example, with ADHD. There's been some fighters saying, look, you legitimately have ADHD, you need to take something, but you're not taking Adderall or you're not taking Ritalin. You're going to have to take for ADHD. It's not as powerful, but that's part of the purpose. You don't want to be there and get cardiac arrest or have an advantage with it being a stimulant. So it may be a situation where they may be able to take it out of competition, but when it comes times for competition, they may switch to another drug for that. Now, I know in other states I've heard people like, well, I need marijuana. Well, why? Well, I got severe headaches. Well, wait, let's forget about the marijuana. You got severe headaches, you're not fighting.
Yeah.
So sometimes they overthink it, maybe too smart for their own good.
Fair enough. So one question that always comes up is when you guys are finding these guys and you see these exorbitant numbers. I think Hector was saying when we had the technical problem earlier, there was a boxer who got fined almost $1 million recently. What happens with this? Is this how you make a living, Keith? Finding
well, that one was an anomaly. It's kind of funny because that was 30% of his purse. Yeah. It's funny. Before we had the hearing, I saw some of the people on some of the message boards like, oh, I wonder if they'll find him 30% like they did Nick Diaz. Yeah, no. They Top Rank will make sure that doesn't happen. What are you talking about? So then they get fined 30%. And then you hear people like, I can't believe they fined him $900,000. It's like, wait a second, we fined him 30%. He just made trust me, I think any fighter would rather be Julio Cesar Chavez walking away with $2.1 million than Nick Diaz walking away with, whatever he walked away with, $200,000. I'm sure Nick would rather have been Julio on that payday. But that's what came of it. Now, whether there should be a cap or something, if people want to argue that, or hey, that 30% makes a lot of sense, but in that situation, because he made so much money, but again, he walked away with more money. He could have been fined 100%. He was fined 30%. But so it depends how you look at it. We look at it as a 30% fine.
Got it.
They look at it as a $900,000 fine. And I understand that. And I understand the arguments. And 2 of our commissioners voted against it. They thought it was too high of a fine. I think there could be a fair argument. Again, I'd rather not see all the name calling and the dishonest additions to the arguments. I never understood that when there's a fair argument on both sides, but one side wants to, in addition to making their fair points, lies about the other side or skews the facts. I think that's probably the worst kind of lying, and unfortunately, I have to see that a lot from the other side. But if it happens, it happens. we'll deal with it. But that's kind of the situation. How much is enough for a penalty? How much is enough for a deterrent? Obviously, if he made $100,000 and was fined 30,000, people probably wouldn't care about it. But he made $3 million and was fined 30%. So the percentage didn't change. It was very consistent. But like I said, 2 of the commissioners of the 5 thought it should have been less than that. Where it'll end up, I don't know. But I think you can easily see 30% is 30%, and just because he made a lot more money than Nick Diaz or another fighter maybe we caught who only made $10,000, why should they get penalized less if you look at it from a percentage standpoint? So I see the arguments on both sides. All that money, though, back to your original question, goes to the state general fund. We don't get any of it. It doesn't increase our budget at all. It's not something that they look at for us. What they're looking for us is because that's not money that necessarily would ever come back again. So they're looking at money for the gate fees, the pay-per-view fees. My best day is when I don't have to file any complaints. I'd rather have a situation where I had no complaints, we had no fines. It means everybody followed the rules, and that'd be a great thing. There's a lot of situations where people come to me and say, well, why didn't you fine that fighter? Look, the fighter did wrong. I'm going to deal with him behind the scenes, but I don't need to have him fined for that. What he did was stupid, but it doesn't rise to the level of discipline. And other people will say, oh, Kaiser's being soft or whatever. And that's fine. But there's some things that where fighters do break rules, but a fine or discipline is not the right call. Other situations, it is the right call.
Yeah.
I got nothing else.
Keith, thank you so much for coming on the show. I have one last question for you before you go. You may or may not answer this, but in the combat sports industry, is there a guy that you would consider someone that you enjoy watching more than others, since you get to see so many fights?
Well, I try not to answer those questions in the sense of I don't want anyone to ever think that I'm favoring one fighter or not. I don't, but I can tell you I just enjoy fighters who see this maybe as more than just a sport. The fight, and I think most of them are like this actually, or they're taking this seriously. They're pro athletes. It's amazing to see perhaps non-fans of the sport sometimes see these guys are just bar fighters. You probably hear that from your friends who maybe not fans of the sport. Oh, these guys are just tough guys getting off bar stools, or they're not real fighters. Even sometimes you'll hear that from other athletes talking about MMA athletes, and it's like, wait a second, they are. In fact, I don't know if there's much other athletes that have that wide span of skills. You have to have endurance, speed, strength, conditioning, strategy, all the things flexibility, all the things that come into play. I'm not sure very few sports have that full range, if any. So that's why, I try to, when I talk to the athletes, which is very rare, I try to stay out of it, but try to explain, hey, you guys are pro athletes, act like it, demand other people to treat you like that. And that's really what I'm looking for, in addition to, and not just in the arena, not just in the cage or in the octagon or in the ring, but outside as well, how they handle themselves at weigh-ins or how they handle themselves to the press. And I think more and more are taking advantage of that situation, and that's what I look for. But no one really specific. Growing up, I grew up in the days of in boxing of Leonard and Ali and people like that, Tommy Hearns. Mm-hmm. But even MMA, I remember the earlier MMAs. I was always, and I can say this safely because he's, I hope, safely retired, Marco Ruiz.
Okay.
Marco Ruiz to me was the first complete MMA fighter. I wish they'd come on. I'm sure he does too. That it got popular earlier in his life because if you remember, he was already kind of older when he came aboard, and then kind of disappeared for a couple of years, then came back, and then disappeared for a couple more years, and then came back. And I remember seeing him when he was training Pedro Hizzo for some fights we had in Nevada. And I always enjoyed him and thought that perhaps if he had been born 20 years later, we would be talking about him being the champion for a very long time. But we'll never know.
Yeah. Well, you just dated yourself, but thank you for
very much
diplomatically answering that question. And thank you again for coming on the show. That's been this week's edition of MMA Nuts. My name's Ingo Weigel.
I'm Mac River.
Keith, guys.
Thank you.
Look at that.
Good night.
All right. Thanks for playing.